Okay, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you, and some people we haven't seen for a while, so it's great to see you coming along and coming to make the numbers up, which is really good. And thank you. My name's Jean James, in case you've forgotten who I am, I'm the president from the Jung Society. Thank you for joining us again here at MacKillop House and online as well. Hello. First, let us acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This evening, we're delighted to welcome someone that occurs when a person believes or realises accurately or not that they have compromised their own standards of conflict or have violated moral standards and bear significant responsibility for that violation. Moral injury arose from the 1999 UN-sponsored ballot in East Timor, of which Martin was a police member. He witnessed premeditated violence by the Indonesian police, military and militia proxies. Dr. Martin Hess was a member of the Australian Federal Police for 30 years as a detective working in investigations, intelligence, surveillance, close protection, and international police deployments. Martin has a PhD in international policing from the Asian Pacific College of Diplomacy at ANU. He is interested in interagency, whole of government cooperation, criminology, and geostrategic affairs. So following Martin's presentation at about a bit after around up to 9, we'll have about 10 minutes or so for a break for another supper and a cup of tea, just to refresh you a bit. And then we'll come back and we'll ask questions. And so people on Zoom, please remain muted while Martin is speaking. Use Zoom chat for comments and we'll open up later for discussion. Thank you, Martin. It's great to have you here tonight.
Well, good evening and thank you. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the police and emergency services workers who keep us all safe and secure 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Their service is our safety. What I'm going to speak about is the UN mission to East Timor in 1999. It was the first time the UN had been involved in East Timor, and it preceded General Cosgrove's interfet intervention. In fact, the violence that came from that mission was the reason that Cosgrove's interfet mission was there. Are you okay? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Talking to the guy next to you. You right? Can you hear me? Right, okay. I was a member of the UNAMET mission, which supervised the ballot of the East Timorese in 1999, which is commonly referred to as the independence ballot. As I said, this preceded General Cosgrove and interfet, and the post-ballot violence which ensued was in fact the reason interfet was required in the first place. UNAMET commenced in early June and withdrew in early September. I was among the first 15 AFP members to enter East Timor at that time, and as such was one of the first Westerners to enter East Timor since the Portuguese withdrew in 1975. They're the sort of things I'm going to be discussing. I apologise for that slide. The print's a little bit small on that one, but the other ones are okay. That one's just a bit small. The BLUF stands for bottom line upfront. That's what's in the contents of this presentation. So I'll be explaining what UNAMET was, be talking a little bit about the difference between police and military, also the difference between PTSD and moral injury. I'll be further defining moral injury, And then I'll look at the psychosocial hazards and UNAMET as far as Australian workplace legislation is applicable. And that's broken down into social factors, work design, and the management of work. I'll speak a little bit about moral injury and moral courage. Then I'll look a little bit at resilience, and then I'll summarise and. All right, there are some of the demographics of what actually occurred during UNAMET. After 24 years of a brutal occupation and counterinsurgency, the East Timorese population cast their vote with an emphatic rejection of a future as an Indonesian province. Of the registered voters, 98% actually cast a vote on ballot day. That's despite all the intimidation and harassment that occurred. Of those, a staggering 78.5% of voters rejected the Indonesian offer of autonomy, which was to remain with Indonesia. It was a palpable demonstration of political will and a determination to have a say in their political destiny. This triggered the overt phase of a scorched earth campaign and a murderous rampage by Indonesian military and police and their militia proxies, resulting in the murder of between 1,400 and 1,600 East Timorese, whose bodies were disposed of by burying them in shallow graves, dropping them down wells, or dumping them in large numbers at sea. This campaign also involved the forced deportation of an estimated 250,000 East Timorese to camps in West Timor. It's believed that the motive behind this was to change the demographics on the ground and to provoke a reaction from the East Timorese Falantel guerrillas, and then to engage in a civil war using conventional military means and thereby retake the province and delegitimise the UN vote. Many AFP members were witnesses to these atrocities and gross breaches of human rights law. As a result, many have experienced post-traumatic stress, and many have experienced what was then an unknown phenomenon, now known as moral injury. Well, actually, could we go back, please? So they're the basic demographics. 270 unarmed peacekeepers were sent in lieu of what was projected to be 12,000 to 16,000 armed military peacekeepers, which the ADF couldn't deliver. And that wasn't the ADF's fault. The Indonesian military refused to have an international peacekeeping force in what they declared to be their sovereign territory. That was also recognised by Australia. It's a very complex diplomatic circumstance that we were deployed under. But just do the figures yourself, 270 unarmed civilian police as opposed to nearly 16,000 fully armed military peacekeepers. That security agreement was negotiated by the Indonesians in full knowledge, in my view, of what was about to come. The Indonesian Special Forces, known as Kopassus, raised some violent militia groups via some infiltration. They had their own sort of internal guards, but they activated them and then they beefed them right up. The actual ballot itself involved things like registration, education, campaigning, the ballot itself, and then the post-ballot phase. There was violence and intimidation throughout all of those phases, but it was extremely acute at the post-ballot period. As I said, 98% of registered voters actually cast a vote, and 78.5% voted one way, that is to reject the Indonesian offer to remain with Indonesia and therefore forge a path to independence, which eventuated in 2002 as the new nation of Timor Leste. With the post-ballot violence, 70% of infrastructure was destroyed by fire primarily. The crimes that were committed were all of those crimes: murder, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, sexual offences, and torture. They're some of the stats. So Sector A was the eastern part of the island, the eastern part of the province. Sector B was central. Sector C was that abutting West Timor, which is where a lot of the militia infiltrated through a fairly porous border between West Timor and East Timor. You can see the casualty rate there. The 1,293 are confirmed murders. It's estimated there's probably another 200 that are unconfirmed, suspected but unconfirmed. Of that, 430 indictments were made by a later UN mission, I have a very good friend, David Savage, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he went back to East Timor. He was part of UNAMET, but he went back as a war crimes investigator with the Special Crimes Unit with a follow-on mission. And he and we're writing a book at the moment actually about East Timor. Yeah. So they're the basic stats. So, yeah, thank you. All right, it's important to acknowledge there's a difference between police service and military service. Often we're lumped together. I've served in the military, I've served in the Australian military, I respect it, but it's got a different societal role to the police. We have a different role. This is a statement actually, which I think is quite relevant, by a guy called Paul Seekart in London, complaining about excessive use of force by the London Metropolitan Police in the 1970s at public demonstrations. But the statement itself is actually quite worthy. The job of the soldier is to kill the Queen's enemies in wartime. The role of the policeman is to protect the Queen's subjects in peacetime. That's a pretty basic definition between the military and the police and our various societal roles. Most studies on moral injury relate to military service in active war zones. Very little research has been done on police in domestic environments, let alone in hazardous international environments such as those associated with the UNAMET deployment to East Timor in 1999. Moral injury is now becoming more recognised as something associated with police service. Sadly, it's now nearly 25 years since the UNAMET deployment, but many members still suffer poor mental health as a result of their service. The implications of the UNAMET deployment in relation to moral injury are profound. Police are accustomed to running towards danger and to resolving volatile situations. It's what we do here. In the case of UNCIVPOL, which is the acronym the UN uses for UN civilian police, in the case of UNCIVPOL in East Timor, this frequently involved intervening in situations where the death or serious injury of East Timorese pro-independent supporters at the hands of Indonesian-backed militia was a constant reality. This was not the mandated role of UNCIVPOL, as the UN agreement left all security in the hands of the Indonesian National Police, which was subservient to the Indonesian military and to their militia proxies, and could not or would not intervene in many cases. Sometimes they did, but in many cases they wouldn't. It was left largely to UNCIVPOL to do this, and by doing so, these actions saved many lives, despite not having any authority or capacity such as basic defensive equipment, such as ballistic vests or helmets. The type of weaponry used by the militia groups ranged from edge weapons such as machetes and knives to homemade firearms known as raketans to military semi-automatic rifles supplied by the Indonesian military. It's also worth remembering that there was no medevac capacity and no medical facility in East Timor capable of adequately dealing with severe lacerations and machete wounds or gunshot wounds. The nearest capable and competent medical facility was the Royal Darwin Hospital, 2.5 hours flight away from Dili. There's little doubt that the actions of UNAMET, especially UNCIVPOL, also prevented the outbreak of further hostilities, which appears to be the objective of the Indonesian military strategists intent on provoking a civil war within East Timor with the pro-independence Falintil guerrilla forces, which had been cantoned as part of the May 5 security agreement. Falintil remained in their cantonments as the Indonesian rampage continued. Had they broken out, as everyone thought they might, then it would have been conventional war and Indonesians would have killed them all. It just would have been a complete massacre. The withdrawal of UNAMET to Darwin in early to mid-September was particularly traumatic for police who felt they were abandoning the East Timorese. Of note, many East Timorese had sought refuge and protection in the UN compound in Dili, and remaining UNCIVPOL had refused to withdraw until safe passage was secured for these people to safety in Darwin. This was successful, and hundreds of East Timorese were eventually evacuated, with the last withdrawing UNCIVPOL to Darwin. Had they remained, they would certainly have been massacred. Just want to outline the basic role of police in our society. This dates right back to the London Metropolitan Police and Peel's 9 principles of policing. So our basic role in society is fivefold. It's important to remember these and bear these in mind as I discuss what I'm about to discuss. Our role in society is to prevent crime, to protect life and property, to detect offences, to bring offenders to justice, and to keep the peace. I'd also like to outline the difference between moral injury and PTSD. Everyone's familiar with the term post-traumatic stress disorder? Yeah. In simple terms, I read a study, I can't remember the name of the guy who wrote it, but basically I thought it was a pretty good description of the difference. PTSD has both relate to a triggering event and the impact of that event. In relation to PTSD, it's more related to safety and security, so it's more of a physical thing. In relation to moral injury, it relates to trust and confidence. Question? Well, yeah, I'll go into a little bit further. But among the most egregious of the many factors involved in the moral injury associated with AFP service with UNAMET is the appalling post-mission treatment experienced by all former AFP UNAMET members. This involves inadequate and inappropriate official recognition and what could legitimately be described as betrayal by both the AFP and by the Australian government generally, as they continue to downplay or deny outright what their Indonesian counterparts actually did, which was commit gross acts of mass murder and other atrocities, sometimes in our presence. As I said, the role of police in our society are all of those, yet in all of these aspects of policing, AFP service with UNAMET was unable to adhere to any of these values or principles. They were all broached. This is the basis for claiming uncivpol service with UNAMET was a classic case of moral injury, a concept which requires further clarification, of course. I'll also follow this up with some discussion about the psychosocial hazards as per the 2011 model Code of Practice under the Safe Work Australia legislation. Oh yeah, so moral injury, it also involves clearly a traumatic event. All of those things involve some sort of moral judgment, moral compass, moral compromise, ethical codes of conduct, which is why it's important to acknowledge what police do in society rather than military. The military go and do violent things on behalf of the government. That's what they do, and good on them for doing it. It's generally justified, generally. The police role is different, and it's important to acknowledge that distinction between police and military. And there's some more writing on that as well. Moral injury can result in enduring psychosocial and spiritual harms and feelings such as guilt, shame, a sense of betrayal and anger, as well as attitudes of mistrust related to mistrust of others. So the psychosocial hazards under the 2011 legislation, workplace legislation, involve social factors, including those two, violence and aggression, relationships and interaction, work design, so all four of those, management of work, all three of those. Of the 14 psychosocial hazards identified in the Model Code of Practice under the Safe Work Australia legislation as having the potential to cause psychological or physical harm, the AFP members deployed to UNAMET in 1999 experienced 9 of them. So 9 out of 14. I'll just go into some detail now about these psychosocial hazards and service with UNAMET. Under the social factors, violence and aggression at the hands of the Indonesian-backed militia groups, they were based on an existing internal security structure which was expanded in late 1998 and early 1999 under the direct control of the Indonesian Military Special Forces, known as Capacis. Two elements of Capacis, known as Venus and Tribuana, were involved in establishing, enhancing, training, supplying, paying, and generally supporting these militia groups in East Timor. This was done covertly to provide some form of cover and concealment and attempted plausible deniability of their activities. The relationship was officially denied by both the Indonesian and Australian governments. This official denial continues to be the case. The militia activities included verbal and physical harassment and intimidation, as well as general violence, including the use of edged weapons and firearms, both homemade and military. These events occurred before the arrival of UNAMET and throughout the entirety of UNAMET in all parts of the province, but it was more pronounced towards the west, the closest to the West Timor border, and the closest actually to the capital, Dili, and some parts of the northern coast. That's where most of the violence occurred. Militia activities were coordinated and phased. The initial intent was to dissuade UNAMET from being established and gaining a foothold on the ground in East Timor. When UNAMET arrived and deployed, the intent was changed to intimidate UNAMET international and local staff with a view to delaying and otherwise obstructing the ballot process through voter registration and education and campaigning phases. When this didn't work, attempts were then made to coerce and convince voters by harassing and intimidating them prior to the ballot actually taking place. As I said, the ballot result, 98% of registered voters actually voted, 78.5% voted one way, 70% of infrastructure was burnt in the post-ballot violence, 1,400 to 1,600, well, we know the confirmed figures of people murdered and disposed of, 250,000 people deported to camps. UNCIVPOL, including AFP members, were witness to many of these events. When the security situation deteriorated to such an extent that withdrawal was the only option in early to mid-September 1999, UNAMET had no option but to withdraw. This took place in stages between 6th and 14th of September from both Dili and Bakhao. Incidentally, we were corralled into both of those cities, Bakhao and Dili, deliberately corralled from the regional areas into those places. And it's no coincidence that they were the two places where the airfields were large enough to take C-130 aircraft to evacuate people. They wanted to get rid of eyewitnesses. The Indonesians wanted internationals out so that there was no witnesses to what was about to come. A number of AFP members refused to withdraw until safe passage could be negotiated to Darwin for the many East Timorese who had sought refuge with the UN in the compound in Dili. This action saved many lives, as there is no doubt that these people would have been murdered by the rampaging Indonesians had they remained in place. Second, relationships and interaction. Police relationships and interaction are built on certain levels of trust. AFP members of UNAMET UNCIVPOL were deployed on the basis of being advisors to the Indonesian National Police and deployed in good faith. They were expected to work with their Indonesian counterparts in good faith. On observing events on the ground and the duplicity involved with the Indonesian police and their subservience to the Indonesian military and fear of the militia groups caused extreme levels of distress. The effective management of relationships and interaction with those members of the Indonesian security forces, police and military who were tasked with the protection of UNAMET, of the UNAMET mission and its personnel, but were in fact predators attempting to prey on pro-independent supporters, was highly complex because there was no basis upon which to build mutual trust. In many cases, unarmed UNCIVPOL, including members of the AFP, were the only people intervening in this environment, and in many cases stood physically between the Indonesian predators and their intended East Timorese prey. The UNCIVPOL were unarmed and did not have any official authority to intervene, but did so because of their innate sense of right and wrong. This is of particular significance as police in their normal duties are accustomed to running towards danger and preventing crime, with particular emphasis on the preservation of life and the protection of property, which is why it's important again to acknowledge what the police do as opposed to other players in the field. Go back. Yeah. One more. Yeah. Back. Just the work values, the psychosocial hazards. Yeah, that's it. The second category of psychosocial hazard is work design. Remote or isolated work. UNAMET was dispersed rapidly throughout the territory of East Timor, often into remote and inaccessible regional areas where the security situation was either unknown or actively hostile to their presence. Most of this hostility arose from militia groups which were covertly supported by the Indonesian military special forces. Members are often isolated in remote areas, working in small electoral teams from a variety of cultures. It's important to acknowledge that as well. And backgrounds in unknown areas and in an uncertain and often very hostile security environment. There was no accommodation provided by UNAMET, and members were required to fend for themselves in areas where suitable accommodation was simply not available. What the militia would do was they would intimidate local people to not support UNAMET with things like accommodation or food or fuel or water or any of that sort of stuff. So that they were terrorising the local population, basically. The living conditions and life support in these remote and regional areas was poor. Infrastructure was non-existent. Members deployed into these areas without rations, communications, fuel, maps, or any form of medevac or medical facilities. Job demands and job control. UNAMET was an electoral mission. UNSIFHOL was required to advise the Indonesian police in their duties as they related to the ballot. And the other part of our mission was to convey the ballot material to and from the polling places on polling day. UNSIFHOL had little control over the location or electoral activities and had no control other than moral influence over the activities of the Indonesian National Police, who in large part were subservient to the Indonesian military, particularly the Kopassus Special Forces, which ran the covert program in relation to the militias. Traumatic events or material. Throughout the entirety of UNAMET, from June to September, UNAMET staff, including unarmed UNSIFHOL, were subject to constant threats and harassment from violent Indonesian militia groups. The threats are either aimed directly at UNAMET staff themselves or at locally engaged East Timorese staff working for UNAMET, or at pro-independent supporters, who were their primary target. There are numerous violent incidents, including UNSIFHOL members intervening between predatory militia groups and their intended prey. These involved extreme acts of bravery and courage in the face of a high risk of death or serious injury, with zero chance of medevac or appropriate medical attention should serious injury be sustained. Upon the announcement of the ballot result, which overwhelmingly rejected the Indonesian offer of autonomy, the militia groups, directly and overtly supported by their Indonesian military controllers, engaged in a premeditated and a widespread scorched earth policy, whereby significant amounts of local infrastructure such as building and bridges were destroyed by arson, and as I said, the 250,000 people exported across the border and the over 1,200 murders. Management of work, organisational justice. The factor between that over 1,200 East Timorese were confirmed murdered by Indonesian forces and their militia proxies during the UNAMET and immediately after the withdrawal of UNAMET between the 6th and 14th of September and before the arrival of Interfet on the 19th to the 20th of September is testimony to just how volatile and dangerous it was for unarmed UNSIFHOL to be in the province at this time. The fact that the relationship between the Indonesian military and militia groups was known to areas within the Australian intelligence community, but not shared with those deploying, borders on, in my view, on criminal negligence. This is exacerbated by the fact that UNAMET worked in small teams in isolated and remote regions with no means of protecting themselves and no medical support capable of dealing with traumatic injuries. This is compounded exponentially when the fact that upon investigation by the UN Serious Crimes Unit in the follow-on mission, UNTAYET, several indictments for murder and other crimes against humanity were levelled at a number of militia members and Indonesian military and police officers, as well as some senior Indonesian officials. A fact made even worse is that none of those indicted have ever been called to answer these allegations or to explain their actions. It appears that the strategic relationship with Indonesia overrides such considerations of justice and that the AFP itself has been complicit in this avoidance of justice by prioritising with the Indonesian National Police prioritising its relationship with the Indonesian National Police over the welfare of its own members. This is particularly egregious to professional police officers whose sworn duty involves bringing offenders to justice. Many members of UNAMET felt betrayed by their senior leadership after their service with UNAMET, and this continues. This has been exacerbated by continued denial of their experiences and ongoing mental health issues, and has been even further aggravated by the appalling post-mission treatment, especially that which is associated with adequate and appropriate official recognition for their service in what remains arguably the most hazardous undertaking by the AFP in its relatively short but distinguished history. Support. The AFP provided very little support upon return to Australia after the UNAMET mission. Members were debriefed in Darwin by Australian intelligence agencies as they arrived in Darwin from East Timor, including myself. These were operational debriefs rather than psychological. Once returned to their home jurisdictions and to their normal duties, the AFP members were largely forgotten or deliberately ignored. I was actually told I went back to City Police Station here in Canberra and I was told to get back to work, that I had my holiday and get back to work. Many had difficulty in readjusting to their normal work environments. In some cases, they were told they had their holiday and it was now time to get back to work. That was my experience, and there was a few others like that as well, particularly in Canberra. This created a severe trust deficit between members and management, particularly senior management levels in the AFP, and at the political level, where as indicated, the strategic relationship with Indonesia took priority, particularly in the era of the global war on terror, following the 9/11 attacks in the United States and other attacks, including the Bali bombings in 2002. Once members had retired, the AFP no longer considered their responsibility and essentially wiped their hands of them. This remains the case. Reward and recognition. The UN begrudgingly awarded a UN medal for service with UNAMET. The reluctance on the part of the UN was because the standard 90-day period for qualification of the award to a UN medal had not been met with UNAMET. The only reason for this was because UNAMET withdrew from East Timor to Darwin before the 90-day period because of the rapid deterioration in security at the hands of the Indonesian militia groups, which was a direct result of the May 5 agreement, the poor security agreement. The AFP similarly vacillated on the qualification period for the Police Overseas Service Medal, but this was eventually awarded. The AFP also invented an award to UNAMET called the Distinguished Service Award. This award had never been awarded before, nor has it been awarded since. It does not appear anywhere on the AFP list of official recognition or awards. It is strongly believed that this award was invented for a dinner where the minister responsible for the AFP, Senator Amanda Vanstone, was the guest of honour and was provided so she had something to give to the members present at the dinner to avoid embarrassing the minister. The entire contingent was awarded a group bravery citation in 2001. This was well received, but fails to recognise a number of individual acts of extreme bravery on the part of UNCIVPOL generally and AFP members in particular. This anomaly was raised through the commissioner of the AFP in 2020, which combined with a non-existent Distinguished Service Award caused the commissioner to initiate the UNAMET Bravery Recognition Project through the recognition and ceremonial area of the AFP. This project employed a researcher who found a number of individual acts of bravery worthy of higher recognition. Nominations were made to the Australian Bravery Decorations Council, which falls under the Office of the Governor-General. After an inordinately long time, the ABDC responded to the Commissioner that the AFP that none of these nominations were successful for higher recognition. No explanation was provided other than that the contingent was awarded a group bravery citation to cover their actions. No formal explanation has ever been provided for this decision, and there is no appeals process, unlike that which exists for the ADF. Despite some assurances by representatives of the government of East Timor, no official recognition has ever been made by that government for the efforts of UNAMET in firstly protecting hundreds of East Timorese from certain death at the hands of the Indonesian forces and militia groups, and secondly for securing the ballot of the population which eventuated in independence of the new nation of Timor Leste in 2002. The gravity of the circumstances and environment surrounding UNAMET is highlighted by the award of the Elie Wiesel Award to the UN for the entire UNAMET mission, including UNCIVPOL. This happened in 2002. The fact that this was never made known to the AFP UNAMET members typifies the attitude the AFP has shown to its UNAMET members. To link what happened in UNAMET with the events in the 1940s Europe demonstrates just how dangerous this mission actually was. The Elie Wiesel Award was raised as a result of the Holocaust in the 1940s. The parallel for that organisation to draw a parallel between UNAMET and what happened in the 1940s just stands out to me. It's never been formally presented to anyone from UNAMET. It was presented to the Deputy Secretary General of the UN in New York, but no further. Let's talk about moral courage and moral injury. Moral courage can sometimes mean doing what is right, even in the most adverse of circumstances. To do the right thing, however, one must know what the right thing actually is to do. Hence the significance of a clear understanding of the role police play in our society. Regrettably, the lack of adequate or appropriate official recognition of the moral courage displayed by UNAMET UNCIVPOL generally, and a number of AFP UNCIVPOL members specifically, has exacerbated the moral injury attached to their service with UNAMET. The continued downplay of the service in the face of what was clearly an orchestrated military campaign, and the denial of this hostile military linkage further adds to this moral injury. The really unfortunate aspect of the experience of UNAMET members is the inertia in what appears to be deliberate attempts on the part of some influential personalities to officially acknowledge the recklessness of the original deployment into a known hostile region in 1999. This is compounded by the continued official denial of the clear link between the Indonesian military and militia groups, the suppression of what these groups did in committing mass murder and other atrocities, and the ongoing efforts to thwart any official acknowledgement or recognition of UNAMET's service. This continued negligence is regarded by some UNAMET members as a deliberate betrayal. This is moral injury in the most classic of cases. A sense of betrayal and associated distrust in leadership, both organisational and political, is not a positive one for functioning police officers to hold. Talk a little bit about resilience. I found a quote in something about, in fact, the 1914-18 war, about resilience of some of the veterans of that terrible conflict. And that was the question that was posed. What mix of personal attributes and societal variables enable some individuals to maintain this adaptive function while others exposed to similar stimuli do not? What explains why certain individuals who might seem to have the qualities required for resilience ultimately prove to be more vulnerable than others? How can this be measured? As people interested in psychology, if moral injury is defined as the damage done to one's conscious or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress their own moral and ethical values or codes of conduct, then it's quite clear that UNCIVPOL service with UNAMET falls well within this definition. The actions of the Indonesian military and police and their militia proxies, as witnessed by unarmed international police, breached all the primary roles of policing: prevention, protection, justice, and maintaining the peace. As mentioned, a follow-on mission conducted a series of investigations into the murders and raised over 400 indictments of Indonesian military and militia, most of whom had fled to Indonesia. To date, the vast majority of these indictments remain unanswered. Arguably, under pressure from governments, including our own, these matters have been quietly dropped, presumably to placate senior Indonesian elites in the face of both militant Islamic jihadism and a rising authoritarian threat from an aggressive and expansionist China. Whilst these are all understood in strategic terms, the moral injury of individual police being unable to fulfil their roles of preventing crime, preserving life, protecting life and property, bringing offenders to justice and maintaining order remains and is still keenly felt and needs to be addressed. as I mentioned, of the 14 psychosocial hazards under the legislation, the Australian legislation, having the potential to cause psychological and physical harm, the AFP members deployed to UNAMET in 1999 had a high level risk of exposure to 9 of them directly. This has led to a lingering sense of guilt, betrayal, and barely suppressed anger amongst many former uncivilized members of UNAMET. This has never been addressed by anyone in any agency at any time since 1999. It's now 25 years since UNAMET, and uncivilized members have lived with this for 2.5 decades. It's time moral injury is officially acknowledged instead of the denial and obfuscation which has been evident today. But as we all know, what gets measured gets done. The most serious question arising from my personal service with UNAMET is how can such an abstract individual and spiritual concept as moral injury be measured, and how can it be addressed? I'm open to suggestions. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Have a break and then we'll come back. Is that okay?
That's
We
fine.
probably need a break after all of that. It's given us so much to think about. Thank you.
I hope it wasn't too dramatic. It's a pretty controversial.
Be doing next month on Friday the 3rd of May, we'll hear from Kirsten. We're going to be talking about the labyrinth with Carl Jung talking, going on about the labyrinths. In Canberra, we've noticed there's quite a lot of labyrinths around, which was rather interesting to note that. We even found one in Dorothea's at the University Hospital. There's a labyrinth there, which we're rather surprised at. And then on Saturday, the 4th of May, we'll be walking around on the real life labyrinth near the lake. So hopefully the weather will be good for that. So that's what something will come up. So we'll go on now to question time with Martin.
Yeah. I feel like I should have a guitar or something. I wouldn't. Again? No, that's fine. Questions? Yes.
Can't see anything.
Very interesting what you were doing today. What I can understand is that when you arrive there, when you arrive in absolute chaos and dangerous situations like that,
Yeah.
and you said no accommodation was provided,
Yeah.
and no food. So how did you manage eventually? No tents, no nothing? And the civilians around there were told not to help you.
It was difficult.
Yes.
Because UNAMET was arranged so hastily, the UN didn't have time to do its normal preparation, etc. Because infrastructure, we flew in from, I'll go back, the AFP was actually tasked with the mission as opposed to the ADF after a meeting in Bali between Prime Minister Howard and the President of Indonesia, Habibie, where the Indonesian military said no international military. So they compromised and said, instead of like the 16,000 fully armed military people, we said 270 unarmed civilian police. 52 of which were AFP.
Mhm.
So that was sort of early May. We deployed, pre-deployed to Darwin in early June. So over the month of May, that included all of the briefings, the preparation of uniform equipment, all that stuff, all of which had to be non-military looking stuff. It all had to be sourced from civilian things to not alert the Indonesians to the fact that, not the fact, to give them any pretext to say these are military people going, we're police. Right? Some of us had reserve experience or some military experience, but we went in as police. So we pre-deployed to Darwin. We stayed at the RAF base at Darwin, the RAF base at Darwin, and awaited whilst, unlike military, we don't sort of have spare capacity. Police worldwide are fully occupied doing what they're doing. So nations started contributing. The Kiwis were the first to arrive. There was 10 New Zealanders, followed by, I think it was 7 British, 2 Irish and 2 Spaniards. We all sort of got together in Darwin and waited for the clearances and things to occur in Dili, and then we deployed. Because the infrastructure in Dili was so poor, we stayed, I think, 1 or 2 nights at a pretty basic hotel in Dili, and then we had to move out because to make way for more people coming in. So we ended up going out through West Timor and then back into a place called Suai. There was a group of, there was Brits, Kiwis, Australians with our contingent, and we just lived off whatever we could. We had Indonesian police escorts with us, but the police escorts, they all drove around in these trucks with polisi, P-O-L-I-S-I, which is the Indonesian word for police, written on the side. There were the Timorese population had been told to fly Indonesian flags to show their solidarity with Indonesia. But there was something clearly wrong, because every time these trucks drove through a village, you couldn't see anybody. People were hiding in their houses. They were scared of the police. So it was something just clearly wrong. So we lived the way we could. We obtained food where we could. We had some Indonesian police who were actually supportive of us, trying to help us. But they eventually became intimidated by the Indonesian military.
Yeah, with 78% of the infrastructure destroyed, so no telephones, no water, no electricity in a lot of places. So, and lack
That
of
was at the end. That was after the ballot.
right, and lack of medical facilities, and a lot of people would have been badly injured by machetes and weapons that they use.
There was one American serviceman shot. He was a police officer from Chicago. He was working in a place called Lakeisha, and on ballot announcement day, I think it was, he was driving in a clearly marked UN Land Rover, and we had been told to remove our police shirts because they had Australian flags on them. Oh yes. And the militia were deliberately shooting at anything with an Australian flag. By this stage, the violence had got to the extreme level, particularly in places like Dili and a few other places on the coast, where the Indonesians, by anecdote, apparently, allegedly were giving these people amphetamines and feeding them with alcohol to make them aggressive. They were shooting at anything that had an Australian flag on it. So we were told to remove our shirts, and we had just basic blue T-shirts with a UNAMET logo on the front and a UN sign on the back. This American guy resembled one of the Australians he was working with, but he took his shirt off in solidarity. And there were well-aimed shots aimed at his head as he was driving the car from a soldier, Indonesian soldier in uniform, using a military weapon. They were headshots. He held his ballistic vest up. He had brought his vest from, he'd been in Kosovo before that. He put his vest up against the window. The ceramic plates deflected the rounds, and 3 rounds went into his abdomen. They eventually got him out by helicopter. The helicopters weren't configured for medevac. They actually had to rip a door off the police station as a stretcher to get him to the helicopter. They got him by vehicle, no, they got him into the helicopter from there to Dili, then transferred him to an aircraft, and then flew him to Royal Darwin Hospital. So all that process probably took 4 or 5 hours, by which time he could have bled out.
Oh,
but he
yes,
didn't. He was lucky, he survived.
Ah,
Right? He was patched up at Royal Darwin and eventually was released and sent back to America. But he was mistaken for an Australian.
Yes, you come there to help. So cool. Okay, I'll pass the mic. Who else has questions?
Are the symptoms the same? Oh, right. Okay. Are the symptoms of moral trauma the same as post-traumatic stress disorder?
I don't know. All I know is that my personal feelings and those of my UNAMET colleagues that I speak to on a fairly regular basis are pretty much shared. We feel betrayed, angry, disappointed, distrustful, and we just feel like we just feel that there's a great injustice that's been done to us, but also to these Timorese that needs to be righted. How we write that, I don't know. I'm writing a book at the moment with Dave Savage, a colleague of mine, and hopefully we'll get it all in on paper. And I guess the court of public opinion will make a judgment on what we've got to say about our story. But individually, I don't know. I have been diagnosed with a little bit of PTSD, but I think the moral injury, the outrage at what has occurred to us is more pronounced than the PTSD. As I said, the difference between the PTSD and moral injury as far as that definition goes is one is a physical thing, the other is a sense of betrayal or a sense of spiritual compromise. So I don't know how to answer that question, so other than my own personal feelings and my own experience. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
How have you dealt? Well, how do you deal with your own moral injury?
I came back from Timor and I got married and had a family. So that distracted me quite significantly for about a decade while the kids were still young. But in the meantime, I'm fairly driven academically, so I did a couple of masters while I was away during that period, and I'd finished it with a PhD. So I get my own frustrations out by writing. I write stuff, and if I ever had an opportunity to speak, I like public speaking, so I like to get things off my chest that way.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
in the break, I asked a question from Gail about how to deal with moral injury, and are psychologists or helpers prepared for that? Have they been educated? It's a very difficult thing to tackle.
yes, it is.
And I suggested that there would be a lot of workshopping with other participants or role playing, because if it's a new thing, which it is, but it's not a new thing really. Moral injury's been there all along, but not named. The military also has it, obviously, when they have to do things they can't stomach.
Yes.
And how to deal with that? How do psychologists deal with
I
it?
think one of the problems is it's an individual thing. Everyone has their own individual moral compass.
Yes.
The reason I gave this presentation the way I gave it was that I didn't look at any particular individual values. I looked at police values. Our role in society is quite distinct, as that's what we do. That's our whole reason for being. We do a whole bunch of other things on top of that, but the 5 primary roles of police are the 5 that I identify. All of those were compromised. So from a moral compass point of view, and they're deeply embedded in all police in any liberal democracy, particularly the Anglosphere, because of our legal system, they're deeply ingrained in most police. Our values are interchangeable with Canadian police values, they're interchangeable with British police values. I caught up with some British police last night that I met for the first time. Identical, different accents, but and different environments, but the values are the same. Values and principles are the same. Same with the Kiwis. So that's a thing that's been compromised.
And I've got some articles on PTSD. I was particularly interested in that. And there is a misjudgment or a lack of adequate ability of many psychologists to deal with that, because they go for the wrong symptoms. And there are different symptoms of PTSD. This term itself has the term stress in it, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And they were saying that stress exhibits itself as a heightened sort of blood flow or muscle movement and all this. Many of these people who suffer from PTSD are sunk in themselves, almost don't move, almost don't breathe. And I can identify with that particular symptom. And the ability to diagnose and therefore then treat is a tricky question. And from my understanding of this report, psychology hasn't fully caught up with that.
I agree. I think it's very difficult. And the other temptation by psychologists, I did some units of psychology when I was doing some studies years ago, when I was doing criminology, and they're wedded to statistics. They love statistics. What gets measured gets done. That's why I put it up there. What gets measured gets done. And all the other stuff is quite subjective, and they tend to ignore that because it's easy to put a number on something. You say, yeah, you're a 7, right? Okay, what's that mean? Well, you're 7 out of 10. There you are. You're 7 out of 10, that's it. But how do you, because it's such an individual thing, that's why I put those questions up there. It's really difficult. I'm open to suggestions on how to do it. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a police officer in a PhD, but I just think these are questions that are going to constantly keep coming up. Now that policing has been included in this whole thing about PTSD and that sort of stuff, and I was talking to some people over here during the break, I would suggest that a police officer in a year of service, with all of the stuff that they see, just an ordinary community police here in Canberra, anywhere in Australia, anywhere in the world, the murders, the assaults, the rapes, the house breakings, the cruelty, all that stuff that police see in a year of service would far outweigh anything most military people would see in a whole lifetime of service. But it's not recognised. It needs to be. I'm an advocate for police and policing generally. I'm a believer in liberal democratic policing, but it comes at a cost. It's just not being addressed properly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, the same would apply to paramedics
Yeah.
dealing with acute
Yes,
situations.
of course. All emergency services do the same thing, but police have the additional weight of potentially being able to legally take a life.
Mhm.
We've got 80,000 police in Australia walking the streets 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Mhm.
How many police shootings do you actually hear about? And the amount of provocation that a police officer puts up with,
Oh, yes.
and yet they don't. That shows a remarkable degree of restraint and adherence to those values.
Well, we do hear about them when they shoot somebody, don't we?
Yes, of course. It makes front page news forever.
Or if you laser an elderly lady in Cooma who's holding a kitchen knife.
I mean, I'm not saying that all police are perfect. I'm not going to answer for every police action, but those things are outliers.
Yeah.
That's not normal behaviour. It's easy to pick on incidents like that and besmirch everybody else. But there's 80,000 cops walking the streets of Australia all day, every day, 24 hours a day, 365, including public holidays. So when you hear of incidents like that, they're the exception rather than the rule, the gross exception rather than the rule.
Yes, and training people to deal with mentally deranged and the like, separate when it's life-threatening and when it's not quite.
Yes.
Dreadful. Yeah.
We do scenario training. Every Australian police officer goes through that sort of scenario training where we're not mental health experts, but our role in society is to deal with crime.
And you've got to make
not to deal with
second
mental health. But the problem is when a police officer encounters something that is criminal and it's been caused by someone's mental health, it puts a police officer in a very difficult situation as to what they're going to do.
Our Jung Society former president and life member Ross White, deceased 18 months ago, was a psychologist who worked with, as I was saying at the break, with police in New South Wales, who would attend to road accidents and so forth on the way to the snow and all that. And as you say, encountered dreadful situations along the way. So those guys would be suffering in many cases from what we would normally call PTSD. That's how they'd be labelled anyway in the mental health industry, I suppose. Two situations that I've encountered at work. One is with a lady who was sort of blown out of a tent in Afghanistan and suffered.
Blown out of a tent.
Yes,
Right.
dreadful burns and so forth. But anyway, she's sort of recovered, but she has young children. But she can't go to a children's Christmas party because of the risk of a balloon might burst. You know, the sound of pop from a balloon would make her go ballistic, and she'd have this great fear, or a car backfiring or anything like that because of her exposure to rockets and so forth. Yeah. So that would be, I think, probably classical PTSD, and I've got no formula for dealing with that, but it's sort of well known. Moral injury perhaps relates to more people which I've seen who maybe worked on the spying on the East Timorese about the greater Sunshine gas field, you know, and all that. Yeah, I won't say too much about that, but those are guys who are suppressing a knowledge of what they did, which they thought at the time might have been was morally wrong, but they were instructed, you know, the government's asked us to do this, blah, blah, blah. You know, one of them's confessed and one burned Caleri and all that.
He's written a book, Oil Under Troubled Waters. It's worth reading.
Yes, indeed. So that's more of the perhaps what we're talking about tonight, where people reluctantly or not did something which over the years and decades since have been concerned about. They sort of regretted and said, "Oh no, in retrospect, this is really not good." Now, in that case, you know, they didn't very directly cause loss of life, etc. But certainly there was severe moral issues about it.
Sure, but they weren't necessarily life-threatening. In relation to that incident with the lady with the balloon popping, I served in Afghanistan for 12 months, and one of the things, I was based in Kandahar airfield, and one of the things they had were a lot of the Taliban used to rocket, they used to get artillery shells and just fire them off and just try to hit something. They weren't really well aimed, but they had these detector things and they would set off a siren. And I was holidaying in New Zealand with my family, and the kids are in the pool, and I was just wandering around this bloody shopping centre, and they've got these alarm things to call their fire brigade. Right? The alarm went off, and I was looking for a bomb shelter to go and find in New Zealand. So yeah. Anyway, so I can sympathise with that situation. I don't particularly like things like when I hear cars backfiring and stuff like that. In fact, when I came back from Afghanistan, we did a debrief in Darwin, and we were staying at a hotel near the airport, and I heard all these gunshots going off. So I actually rang the police. I rang the Northern Territory Police and said, told them who I was and where I'd come from, and they said, they rang me back. It was a clay pigeon range quite close to the Darwin airport, and they were practicing on a weekend. They were shooting on a weekend, but that was the first thing that went through my mind, is that there's an attack going on. So you certainly become your awareness is far more heightened in those circumstances, and that's what you focus on. You don't think of normal things.
Well, it's an airport place, doesn't it? The airport there also.
It's the same airport. They're on opposite sides.
Martin, I was just going to ask you about what's presented as a distinction between organisational values and personal individual values. And I just wonder whether moral injury makes sense when you're talking about an organisation, or whether it has to be connected to an individual. And the second thing is that in a recent study, the statistics seem to show, I don't know whether it was accurate or not, that some people suffer PTSD and some people don't. And as the researchers delved into this, they observed a characteristic in people suffering PTSD, that they had a high ability to visualize consequences and future and project a vision for what might happen in the future. Whereas other people, maybe most people, tend to be more focused on the present and don't have that ability to plan or have that foresight. And that second category of people don't seem to suffer PTSD the way the first category do. I just didn't know whether you're...
The other way around it. So you're talking about big picture, little picture type thinking.
Not so much that, but the ability to throw your mind forward into having some perception of what the future outcomes might be. Those people seem to have more of a sense of dread than people who are focused on the immediate. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I can't comment on that, but certainly your first question in relation to individual values versus institutional values.
Yeah, organise that. Yeah. I can understand how you're presenting the police force as having a series of corporate values, and that
it's not just values; it's our role in society. Our role in society is those 5 things. That's what we do.
Yeah, I'm accepting that as well.
So all of those are compromised in these teams.
But you will have people within that organisation who have internalised those values, and you'll have people who haven't internalised those values. It happens in every organisation.
I think that's true, but most serving police officers, rather than staff members,
Yeah.
would have an innate sense of those 5 values or those
Sure.
5 roles.
Yeah, that's why they signed on.
Other things that extend from that, things like minimum use of force and force as a last resort, all that sort of stuff all comes from that, because that's the way we're trained.
Yeah.
So
then you're bringing the organisational value down to the
become your own
individual.
individual principles and values. That's how you live your life. So.
I'm not quite sure. I'm thinking as I'm saying it, but I thought of moral injury as something that often happens, like this is with military, when people who are there to fight enemies actually are injuring people who are not military, who are collateral damage, civilians, or soldiers who might find themselves acting in a way against their military values and raping, or, in those moments they come back, and that's part of their...
This is for the room, that's for the...
Part of their... their trauma. And we're sort of not really sure whether moral injury is the same as trauma. There's a lot of words, but I think what Jim was saying about organisational and individual, it seems to me from what you've been saying tonight that you did a bloody good job over there, and that you did prevent a lot of deaths by sticking to your values and doing the best that you could with the resources that you had.
I would agree with that statement.
But that the moral injury really should be owned by those forces in diplomacy and government and whatever else, who were somehow manipulating and conniving in the situation to bring about ends suited to their own means and power, whatever. That there's unnecessary guilt, really. There's certainly pain of what you went through and what you saw, but the guilt doesn't really reside with you.
Which is why I suggested the change from the subject matter being moral guilt, which is part of it, to moral injury, which is a much broader topic. Guilt is culpability. It's got, as a police officer, guilt actually means certain things, but I don't think we're guilty of anything other than doing what we were asked to do, and then more. Our mandate was actually to advise Indonesian police and to convey the ballot material to and from the ballot places on polling day. That was it. But we did so much more. So, and I think that's, and that so much more was where the compromise comes in, because literally people were standing with soft, empty hands and a blue shirt saying, you're not going to kill these people. Facing armed people with military weapons, saying you're not going to shoot them. So
I think that's what Jung would call moral courage.
well, moral courage is really important. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the problems is that just hasn't been acknowledged.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to define. You can't put a number on it. You can't say that's a 7. Right? You just can't do it. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means you can't quantify it.
But this is what the Vietnam veterans felt when they came
Correct.
back. Yeah.
We have a great affinity. A couple of the guys that we served with had served in Vietnam with the Australian Army. A couple of UNAMET guys. And you know, they've been doubly dosed by this negligence. And the other problem is that the military is now trying to come to terms with this stuff, and good on them for doing it. But police are lagging way behind.
Yeah.
Way behind.
Yeah.
In this sort of thing.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just picking up that last point, you look at the working definition of moral injury as you have it up on the screen there. It occurs when a person believes or realises, accurately or not, that they have compromised their own standards of conduct.
Yeah.
And just stopping at that point, everything you've described tonight is people standing up for their values despite the adverse situation that they find themselves in, and the fact that external circumstances are not helping them adhere to their own values. And then the second part of the definition is that the people believe or realise that they've violated universal moral standards and bear significant responsibility for that violation. Now, in the context of East Timor, it seems to me extremely difficult to say rationally, objectively, that any of those people on that mission had any responsibility for any inconsistency between personal values and the context, the adversarial context in which they found themselves.
Correct. It was the UN, it was the May 5 agreement that was the problem. Negotiated between Portugal as a former colonial power, Indonesia as the occupying power, and the United Nations as the broker.
Yeah, I'm just suggesting maybe that definition needs a broader frame of reference, that's all.
Sure.
We'll have to buy the book when it's coming out. But when are we going to see the book?
That's a saga.
We want an autograph copy.
Oh yeah. Yep.
When I look at that definition there, the first line moral injury occurs.
That's a working definition. It's not. It's just something that I put together. It's not a.
Oh.
Don't hold me.
Oh, okay.
Too strongly to that definition.
Because I would think it might occur too when you witness something that you can't do a thing about.
Yeah.
That you're not responsible for, but that lives on in your mind. You know what I'm referring to there? That it's because it says that they have compromised their own standards. It could come under that, of have violated and bear significant responsibility for that violation. I can imagine many situations where you're a witness and there's not a thing you can do about the thing, and that is terrible too, because you suffer with that.
Yeah. I mean,
just like you did.
As I said, the fault really lies with the May 5 agreement, because that was made by people who had no skin in the game.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
We were sent in lieu of a military. We were sent there by the Foreign Affairs Department.
Yes.
They had no skin in the game. The Electoral Commission actually put the ballot together. They were so concerned about the security situation, they didn't put people in there. They got the UN to do this stuff. Right? They designed the ballot and put all the papers and stuff together. The organisations, the intelligence organisations, they knew what was going on. Did they share it with us? No. So those with the most skin in the game were, which was us, were completely excluded from the whole process. So it is a, I don't like the word betrayal under those circumstances. It was a compromise.
Yeah.
The Australian government was put in a situation where they lit the fire by sending a letter to the Indonesians. The Indonesians reacted in a certain way to what was contained in that letter, and they wanted the whole thing was that the letter said they wanted to look at things over, say, a 10 or 15 or 20-year period, so that people could get socialised with the whole idea of remaining with Indonesia, settle down the insurgency and whatever. But because it mentioned the Matignon Accords from New Caledonia, the Indonesian president overreacted. He didn't want to be likened to being a colonial power. And so he said, let's do it right now. And that's what set the cat amongst the pigeons. The Indonesians burred up by creating their militia groups, and Australia had to react. And when at the Bali meeting in April, when Howard had met Habibie and the Indonesian military said no international military at all, they had to come to a compromise. We were that compromise. That's what happened.
Yeah. When Indonesia gained independence in 1949, too, shortly after they demanded that Irian Jaya or West New Guinea be theirs too.
Yeah.
I had an uncle working there, he lost everything. But so there is a tremendous push for territorial integrity of any nation, of any group of people. Territory means a lot, and it's no excuse, but I can imagine that East Timor, which was Portuguese, to them was Indonesian, and therefore, you know, these things that you were involved with occurred, and that's the unfortunate thing. It's territory.
Well, it's territory, but there's other things at play as well. Because of the Portuguese influence there, they've been there for about 300 odd years. It was a very Catholic place, very Catholic, as opposed to anywhere else in Indonesia. So Indonesia is a whole panoply of religion and cultures, but it's primarily Islamic.
Yes.
But Timor, what used to be called Portuguese Timor, extremely Catholic and still is, extremely Catholic.
Right.
And that was a cultural thing.
Yeah.
Ethnically, they're no different to their counterparts in West Timor, and that was a Dutch-controlled province. So these colonial aspects of things, these colonial inputs into things, certainly have their impact. But the legacy is the religious thing.
Yes, yeah, I can see that.
And that created also, amongst the resistance movement, some serious Catholic solidarity around the world. Through the Irish, for instance. The Irish were pretty involved in that sort of stuff. The Vatican was involved in it. I was brought up as a Catholic, but I'm not an activist in that sort of way like that. But the Catholic solidarity movement was quite strong, supporting East Timor.
I wonder if you could draw any comparison with the situation in Cambodia after Pol Pot and that, when under the auspices of the UN, a lot of elections were held. Our General John Sanderson, did you encounter him, or was he pretty well before your time?
I've met him a couple of times, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, he was the commander-in-chief of the UN forces there, apparently.
Yeah.
We do the washing up from morning tea at the church and that with him sometimes. He describes himself as a failed retiree. He said, John, who are you, you know? introducing him. And then, of course, he became the governor of Western Australia and done all sorts of other jobs for the government. But again, that was a different situation, I think, when I don't know the details, the Vietnamese kicked out Pol Pot and so forth. And then there was this turmoil of a new lot of elections. But that was a case where there was a very specific military intervention, I think, to manage the election process.
I went to a presentation by John Sanderson at ANU, and he told a very good story. I'm going to relate it because it just made me laugh. When he first arrived, he was the Australian Commander-in-Chief, right? He was the guy in charge of the whole UN mission. They had a celebration, welcoming drinks and stuff, and they filled him full of grog. And he went to his quarters and slept it off. And in the morning, I think it was an Indian military band were playing outside his barracks while with this hangover. And it wasn't, he sort of woke up to this thing. It wasn't till a few bars into it that he realised they were playing Onward Christian Soldiers as the tune, which I thought was pretty funny. Sanderson is a lovely guy. He's a really, really nice guy. I've looked a little bit at the Cambodian situation. We had two contingents go to Cambodia, the AFP. They had Australian military. The difference between Cambodia and East Timor is that they had a huge military contingent there. I mean, it's a very dangerous situation with Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge and that sort of stuff. These guys still weren't disarmed. They were still active. The police were armed. I've got a couple of UNAMET guys, my friends, had also served in Cambodia with the UN, with UNTAC. And one of them was the guy responsible for the police firearms. They actually took firearms over there. They were in a locked trunk under this guy's bed. And he had the keys to the trunk. So in East Timor, apparently there were firearms available to us at Howard's insistence. We don't think they ever made it out of Canberra. I don't think they even made it to Darwin. No one knows where they went. Well, I can't find out where they went. There are allegedly also 50 ballistic vests. No one knows that to them either. And the supposition is that they didn't want to alert the Indonesians to our distrust of them by going with ballistic vests and helmets and firearms. But we did take cleaning kits. We took firearms cleaning kits with us. Figure that out. So anyway, it was put together pretty hurriedly. So anyway, but the Indonesians had a fairly significant input into the Cambodian situation with these things called JIMs, Jakarta Informal Meetings, because Indonesia was an up-and-coming member of ASEAN, founding member of ASEAN. It was seen as an honest broker to get the Cambodian situation, to get the warring parties in Cambodia to come to an independent place like Jakarta, so they could sit down and they could talk through their difficulties. That was in 1991, 92. So, but 7 years later, one of the reasons Indonesians reacted so badly was because their good name had been compromised by the fact that the UN had to go in and sort their bloody problems out in East Timor. So I think there's repercussions from that as well. The East Timor interventions, UNAMET, UNTAYET, Interfet, and a few other things were actually listed by bin Laden when he was indirectly directing Jamaat Islamiyah to set bombs in Bali. It's indirectly related to it. So he listed Australia as a crusader nation because of our involvement in East Timor.
Well, George W. Bush, he used the word crusade, I think, and his minders had to pull him up on that pretty smart.
I'm talking about Bush, I'm talking about bin Laden. I don't care what Bush said.
Oh, yeah.
I'm talking about bin Laden. He's the bad guy. He's the guy who inspired all these Islamic people to go around the world and bomb people, kill people, innocent civilians, including 88 Australians in Bali, of 202 people who were killed in Bali. So, and he directly related that to Australia as a crusader nation. I don't think Bush ever said that. Bin
No, he
Laden
said-
did.
He said something like, I think we need a crusade against the Bin Laden and co. Yeah.
Well, anyway, so Australia is a crusader nation because of our involvement in East Timor. He likened East Timor to an Islamic province. Wrong, totally incorrect. It was a Catholic province because of the influence of the Portuguese. So he was factually incorrect. But that didn't stop the people who he was trying to G up in Indonesia, the Islamists, from interpreting his words the way that he wanted them to interpret. And it was either a direct or indirect result of his words likening Australian involvement in East Timor to making Australia and Australians legitimate targets of the Jamaat Islami. So,
Thank you very much. It's been
You're
wonderful
welcome.
having you tonight. It's been really, truly wonderful.
oh, thanks.
So,
Oh, thank you.
appreciation.
Thanks.
Something in a proper way somewhere in that record.
The ballroom.
And,
Except I don't have a ballroom. Thank you.
well, someone so passionate about your life and work, it's been wonderful to have something a little bit different. We try to have a variety of speakers coming to the Young Society, and it's been good to have a bit of change in the variety.
Well, I'm always available.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for that. And we're on the 3rd of May, we have Kirsten coming to talk to us about the labyrinth and Carl. And then on the Saturday, the 4th, we go walking the labyrinth. We'll let you know more information online about that. We're trying to do amazing things. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I know it's a little bit wet and not so good to come out on a rainy night. We're not used to rainy nights, so we're used to hot nights. It's raining out there. Thank you very much. It's lovely to see you.
If anyone wants a business card, I've got some cards here if you want to contact me for any other public speaking engagements, because I love it.
We would mind the card to keep. Selection. Thank you very much.